The radio crackle was desperate. Any aircraft, this is SEAL Team 6. We are surrounded by approximately 200 hostiles. Ammunition critical. Casualties mounting. Request immediate close air support or we are done. Captain Zoey Carter was 40,000 feet above an unnamed region in a classified location when she heard the call. She had 12 minutes of fuel remaining. The target was in a canyon where one wrong move meant flying into a mountain wall. But 12 Navy SEALs were about to die unless someone did the impossible. Zoey pushed the stick forward and dove toward hell, her 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon loaded with 1,174 rounds of armor-piercing death. What happened in the next 8 minutes would be studied at every military academy in the world. Meet Captain Zoey Carter. 28 years old, 5'6" with a runner's build, sandy blonde hair kept in a tight regulation bun, and green eyes that could spot enemy positions from altitudes that made other pilots nervous. She had been flying the A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately called the Warthog, for 6 years, accumulating over 800 combat hours across 3 deployments to regions that officially didn't exist on any map. The A-10 was the most feared by anyone on the ground who found themselves on the wrong end of its weapon systems. Built around a 7-barrel GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon that fired 30mm depleted uranium rounds at 3,900 rounds per minute, the A-10 was essentially a flying gun. Everything else, the engines, the armor, the wings, was just there to get the gun to where it needed to be. And Zoey Carter was one of the best A-10 pilots in the Air Force. She had been on a routine patrol mission over a mountainous region in an undisclosed location, providing overwatch for ground forces, conducting operations against hostile forces. The terrain below was brutal, jagged peaks, deep valleys, and terrain so remote that mapmakers had simply labeled it unexplored territory in classified briefings. It was her 3rd sortie of the day, and she was getting low on fuel when the distress call came through. Any aircraft, this is SEAL Team 6, call sign Trident 11. We are surrounded by approximately 200 hostiles in grid coordinates classified. We have taken casualties, ammunition is critical, and we are requesting immediate close air support. I repeat, immediate CAS or we are compromised. The voice was steady despite the circumstances, the mark of professional special operations soldiers who had been in bad situations before. But Zoey could hear the background sounds, automatic weapons fire, explosions, men shouting coordinates and casualty reports. She checked her fuel gauge. 12 minutes to bingo fuel, the point where she'd have to break off and return to base or risk running out of fuel over hostile territory. The coordinates the SEALs had given were 40 miles northeast of her current position in terrain so treacherous that most pilots avoided it entirely. In an A-10, that was about 4 minutes of flight time. That would leave her 8 minutes on station, 8 minutes to make a difference between 12 SEALs going home or dying in an unmapped valley. Trident 11, this is Hog 27, Zoey transmitted using her call sign. I copy your request for CAS. I'm 4 minutes out from your position. What is your situation? The response came back immediately, relief evident even through the professional military brevity. Hog 27, Trident 11. We are pinned down in a narrow valley, approximately 200 meters long by 50 meters wide. Enemy has us surrounded on 3 sides, east, west, and south. North is blocked by a sheer cliff face. Enemy forces estimated at 200 fighters with heavy weapons including RPGs and .50 caliber machine guns. We have 4 casualties, 2 critical. We are down to less than 100 rounds total. Zoey's mind was already processing the tactical situation. A narrow valley meant limited maneuvering room for her aircraft. 3 sides of enemy forces meant she'd need multiple gun runs from different directions. And 200 hostiles with heavy weapons meant this was going to be the most dangerous flying of her career. Copy that, Trident 11. Can you mark your position? Affirm. Hog 27. Popping orange smoke in 3, 2, 1, mark. Zoey descended from 40,000 feet to 20,000, her eyes scanning the terrain below. The region was unlike anything she'd seen before: mountains that seemed to emerge from nowhere, valleys that twisted like serpents, and rock formations that created natural fortresses. This was terrain that swallowed armies and never gave them back. There, a thin column of orange smoke rising from a valley that looked impossibly narrow from her altitude, nestled between peaks that hadn't been properly charted. She contacted the Air Operations Center. Ares Control, this is Hog 27. I'm responding to troops in contact in the unmarked valley region, requesting immediate clearance for danger, close fire mission. Hog 27, Ares Control. Be advised, that region is unmapped territory with extreme terrain hazards. You are cleared hot, but recommend extreme caution. Bingo fuel in 12 minutes. You need to make this quick. Roger that, Ares. Going in. Zoey pushed the A-10 into a dive, the aircraft responding with the deliberate, steady feel that had made it a favorite among pilots who valued reliability over flash. She armed her GAU-8 cannon, selected armor-piercing incendiary rounds, and began her attack run. At 12,000 feet, she could see the valley clearly. It was worse than she'd thought, barely 50 meters wide in places, with steep walls that rose hundreds of feet on both sides. The terrain was a nightmare of rock spires, hidden ravines, and elevation changes that made standard approach patterns suicidal. Enemy forces were positioned on the ridgelines, firing down into the valley where the SEALs were pinned. The hostile fighters had chosen their ambush point perfectly, a natural killing ground where escape was impossible and reinforcement would be nearly as deadly as staying put. Trident 1-1, Hog 2-7, I have visual on your smoke. Recommend you get as low and as covered as possible. I'm coming in hot on the eastern ridge first. Copy, Hog 2-7. We are as low as we can get. You are cleared to engage. Zoey lined up her first run, aiming for the eastern ridge where she could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions. The approach was complicated by rock spires that jutted up from the valley floor like nature's anti-aircraft weapons. She had to thread the needle between formations that could tear her wings off if she miscalculated by even a few feet. The A-10 descended through 8,000 feet, 6,000 feet, 4,000 feet, lower than most pilots would dare in this kind of terrain. Zoey's hands were steady on the controls, her eyes constantly scanning for obstacles, her mind calculating angles and distances with the precision of a computer. At 2,000 feet, she squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 Avenger roared to life with its distinctive sound, a deep, resonant thunderclap that echoed across the valley. Every second of fire sent 65 rounds of 30mm ammunition downrange, each round the size of a beer bottle, traveling at 3,500 feet per second. The eastern ridge erupted in explosions as the depleted uranium rounds tore through rock, equipment, and enemy fighters. Zoey held the trigger for 3 seconds, 195 rounds that turned a 100-meter stretch of ridgeline into a kill zone. Rocks shattered, weapons disintegrated, and enemy positions simply ceased to exist under the onslaught. She pulled up hard, the A-10's wings groaning under the G-forces as she climbed and banked left for another run. A rock spire passed so close to her left wing that she could see individual cracks in the stone. Hog 2-7, Trident 1-1. Excellent hits on the eastern ridge. Enemy is breaking formation on that side. Can you hit the western ridge? Roger, Trident. Coming around now. Zoey banked the A-10 in a tight turn that brought her around for an attack run on the western ridge. This one was trickier. The ridge was closer to the SEAL position, and the terrain was even more challenging. A series of natural rock columns created obstacles that required her to fly in a slalom pattern just to reach the firing position. She descended again, weaving between rock formations that seemed designed to kill aircraft. At 1,500 feet, she had a clear shot at the western ridge and fired. Another 3-second burst, another 195 rounds of hell raining down on enemy positions. Through her canopy, she could see secondary explosions as her rounds hit ammunition stores or fuel supplies. The western ridge transformed into a storm of fire and shrapnel. Direct hit, Hog. You just took out their heavy weapon position on the west side, but we still have the bulk of them on the southern approach. But Zoey wasn't done. She had one more side to clear, the southern approach where the majority of the enemy forces were concentrated and where the terrain was at its absolute worst. This run was the most dangerous. The southern ridge was higher, protected by natural rock formations that created a maze of obstacles. She'd have to fly even lower into the valley to get the right angle, threading through terrain that was designed to kill anything that flew through it. Trident 1-1, I'm down to 5 minutes of fuel. I can make one more gun run on the southern ridge, then I have to RTB, make it count. Understood, Hog. The southern ridge is where most of them are concentrated. If you can break them there, we can fight our way out. Zoey came in from the north this time, diving into the valley itself rather than attacking from above. It was insanely dangerous, flying at 350 knots through a narrow valley with walls on both sides and rock formations that emerged from the terrain like dragon's teeth. The valley twisted and turned, forcing her to bank hard left, then right, then left again. Her altitude warning was screaming continuously as she dropped below 500 feet, the minimum safe altitude for this kind of terrain. Rock walls flashed past her canopy so close she could see individual stones. But that's what the SEALs needed, and that's what Zoey Carter delivered. She spotted a gap in the rock formations that would give her a clear shot at the southern ridge. It required flying through an opening barely wider than her wingspan, pulling up at exactly the right moment to avoid slamming into the cliff face ahead. Zoey didn't hesitate. She lined up the approach, flew through the gap with feet to spare on either side, and pulled up sharply just as the southern ridge came into view. The enemy fighters on the ridge were positioned perfectly to fire down into the valley, but they weren't expecting an A-10 to come screaming up from below at 400 knots. Zoey pointed the nose of her aircraft at the ridge and fired. 3 bursts, each lasting 3 seconds, nearly 600 rounds total, every single one finding targets on the southern ridge. The concentrated firepower was devastating. Enemy fighters were torn apart by the massive 30mm rounds, fighting positions disintegrated, vehicles exploded in fireballs that sent debris tumbling into the valley below. Zoey pulled out of the valley with barely 100 feet of clearance, her warning systems screaming about terrain proximity, fuel status, and the dozen other emergencies that her maneuver had created. She'd just flown through terrain that training manuals said was unsurvivable, delivering fire that turned the tide of an impossible battle. Trident 1-1, Hog 2-7, I am Winchester on gun runs and Bingo on fuel. I have to break off now. Can you move? The response came back with audible relief and gratitude. Hog 2-7, you just saved 12 lives. The enemy is in full retreat on all sides. We are moving now. Thank you doesn't begin to cover it. Stay safe, Trident. Hog 2-7 is RTB. Zoey climbed back to altitude and turned toward base, her fuel gauge showing just enough to make it back if she didn't encounter any problems. Her hands were steady on the controls, but her heart was pounding with the adrenaline of having just flown the most dangerous mission of her career through terrain that shouldn't have been survivable. Have you ever done something that scared you more than anything you'd ever attempted, knowing that failure meant people would die? Sometimes courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing it anyway. Zoey landed at the classified forward operating base with less than 2 minutes of fuel remaining. As she taxied to her parking spot, she could see a crowd gathering, unusual for a routine return from patrol. When she climbed out of the cockpit, she understood why. The base commander, Colonel Sarah Mitchell, was there along with several other officers and what looked like the entire maintenance crew for the A-10 squadron. The crew chief, Master Sergeant James Rodriguez, was staring at her aircraft in disbelief. Captain Carter, I need to inspect your aircraft for damage. Some of the radio traffic we heard suggested you were flying through terrain that should have torn the wings off. The A-10 is built tough, Sergeant, Zoey replied. Ma'am, with respect, the A-10 is built to take ground fire, not to thread through rock formations at 400 knots. We're going to need to do a complete structural inspection. Colonel Mitchell approached with a mixture of admiration and concern. Captain Carter, that was some of the most aggressive flying I've ever heard described over the radio. You just saved an entire SEAL team with flying that would make test pilots nervous. Thank you, ma'am. Just doing my job. That was considerably more than just doing your job, Captain. Flying into that unmapped valley at those altitudes? That's the kind of flying that wins medals or ends careers. In your case, probably both. Over the next hour, Zoey was debriefed on the mission. The intelligence officers wanted every detail: altitudes, angles of attack, terrain navigation, enemy positions, damage assessment. The footage from her targeting pod was already being analyzed, and what they saw made experienced combat pilots shake their heads in disbelief. Preliminary estimates suggest you neutralized approximately 150 enemy fighters in those gun runs, the intelligence officer reported. The remaining forces broke and retreated into the mountains, allowing the SEAL team to extract with no additional casualties beyond the initial wounded. What about their wounded? Zoey asked. Medevac got them out 30 minutes after you cleared the area. Both critical casualties are stable and expected to survive. All 12 SEALs are going home because of what you did today. That night, Zoey was in the pilot's ready room, writing her after-action report and trying to process what she'd just accomplished when the door opened. 12 men in combat gear walked in, led by a Navy SEAL commander who looked like he'd been through a war. "Captain Carter?" he asked. Zoey stood up. "That's me." "Lieutenant Commander Nathan Cross, SEAL Team 6. My team wanted to meet the pilot who saved our lives today." The 12 SEALs filled the room, and Zoey suddenly felt very small, surrounded by these elite warriors. But Cross extended his hand with genuine warmth and respect that transcended rank or service branch. "We listened to the radio traffic while you were making those runs," he said. "We heard you flying through that valley at 500 feet, weaving through rock formations that we couldn't even see from the ground. That was the craziest, bravest, most incredible flying any of us have ever witnessed. You flew into terrain that kills helicopters and somehow brought an A-10 through it to save us." One of the other SEALs stepped forward. His name tape read, Martinez. "Ma'am, we've worked with a lot of pilots. Fast movers, helicopters, drones, every kind of air support the military has. But we've never seen anyone fly like you flew today. You didn't just provide fire support, you became part of our team, took the same risks we were taking." "The A-10 is built for exactly that kind of mission," Zoey replied modestly. "Close air support, danger close, troops in contact. That's what the Warthog does." "The aircraft is built for it," Cross agreed. "But it takes a special kind of pilot to actually do it in terrain like that. Most pilots would have said it was impossible, made high-altitude passes, stayed safe. You came down into that nightmare valley with us. You put yourself in the same danger we were facing." Another SEAL, whose name tape identified him as Jackson, spoke up. "Ma'am, when we first got ambushed in that valley, we thought we were done. 200 hostiles, perfect ambush position, no way out. We'd made peace with not making it home. Then we heard your voice on the radio, and we had hope. When we heard the sound of that cannon, we knew we were going to live." "You guys were in that danger because of the mission," Zoey said. "I wasn't going to let you face it alone if I could help." Cross pulled something from his tactical vest. It was a SEAL trident pin, the symbol of naval special warfare, one of the most respected emblems in the military. "This is from my team. We want you to have it. You earned it today." "I can't accept that," Zoey protested. "I'm not a SEAL." "I haven't been through BUD/S or earned that right." "No," Cross agreed, "but you saved SEALs when no one else could or would. You flew through terrain that should have killed you to bring us home. In our book, that makes you one of us. That makes you family. Take it." Zoey accepted the pin with hands that weren't quite steady. In the special operations community, earning respect from the SEALs was the highest honor a support operator could receive. The trident wasn't just a pin, it was a symbol of brotherhood, of shared sacrifice, of bonds forged in combat. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for trusting me to get you out of there." "Thank you for being skilled enough and crazy enough to actually do it," Cross replied with a grin. "You've got a call sign now, by the way." "The guys have been talking, and we all agree. We're calling you Valkyrie, the one who decides who lives and dies in battle." "Valkyrie," Zoey repeated, testing the name. "It fits," Martinez said. You came down from the sky like something out of mythology and decided that we were going to live instead of die. That's what Valkyries do. 3 days later, Zoey was called to Colonel Mitchell's office. She expected another debriefing or perhaps some administrative paperwork about the mission and the structural inspection her aircraft had undergone. What she found instead was General Rebecca Thompson, a 2-star general she'd never met before, sitting behind the colonel's desk. The general's uniform showed she was from Air Combat Command Headquarters. Zoey snapped to attention. "Ma'am, Captain Carter reporting as ordered." "At ease, Captain." "Sit down." Zoey sat, wondering what a 2-star general was doing at a classified forward operating base. "Captain Carter, I've reviewed the footage from your mission 3 days ago. I've read the reports from the SEAL team, the intelligence assessment, Colonel Mitchell's recommendation, and the structural analysis of your aircraft. I've also consulted with several experienced A-10 pilots and test pilots about the tactical situation you faced." Zoey waited, her heart pounding. The consensus is that what you did was either the most skilled piece of close air support flying in modern history or the most reckless disregard for every safety protocol we have. The engineering team that inspected your aircraft found stress marks on the airframe consistent with maneuvers that exceed design specifications. You bent that airplane in ways it wasn't meant to bend. "Ma'am, General Thompson held up a hand. "Let me finish. You flew at altitudes and through terrain that our training manuals explicitly prohibit. You performed combat maneuvers in an environment where our tactical doctrine says A-10s cannot operate. By the book, you violated approximately 17 different regulations and should probably face a board of inquiry." Zoey's stomach sank. "However," the general continued, her expression softening slightly, "you also saved 12 Navy SEALs who were facing certain death. You eliminated a significant enemy force in terrain they thought made them invulnerable. And you demonstrated the kind of pilot judgment, skill, and raw courage that we try to instill in every Air Force aviator, but rarely see executed so perfectly under such impossible conditions." The general stood and walked around the desk. "Captain Carter, I'm here to inform you that you're being awarded the Air Force Cross for extraordinary heroism in military operations against an armed enemy. This is the second highest military decoration that can be awarded to a member of the United States Air Force, and it's being awarded because what you did goes beyond valor. It redefined what we thought was possible." Zoey couldn't speak for a moment. The Air Force Cross was incredibly rare, awarded only for actions that met the highest standards of heroism. "You're also being promoted to Major, effective immediately," General Thompson continued, "and you're being reassigned to the A-10 Weapons School at Nellis Air Force Base as an instructor, where you'll teach the next generation of Warthog pilots how to provide close air support when conventional tactics aren't enough." "Thank you, ma'am," Zoey managed to say. "I don't know what else to say." "Say you'll keep flying like that when Americans need you," the general replied. "We need pilots who understand that sometimes the mission requires going beyond what's safe, what's easy, or what the manual says is possible. You proved you're one of those pilots. Now, go teach others to be the same." The promotion ceremony was held 2 days later. Zoey's parents flew in from Colorado, proud but terrified after learning the details of what their daughter had actually done. Her fellow A-10 pilots were there, along with Colonel Mitchell, General Thompson, and the 12 SEALs she'd saved. As General Thompson pinned the Major's oak leaves on Zoey's uniform, Cross leaned in and whispered, "Every SEAL team in theater knows about you now. They're calling you Valkyrie, and they know that if you're in the air when they're in trouble, they're going home alive. That's a hell of a reputation to have." The ceremony concluded with the presentation of the Air Force Cross. As the general read the citation, describing the mission in terms that made it sound even more impossible than Zoey remembered, she felt the weight of what she'd accomplished settle onto her shoulders. She hadn't just saved 12 lives. She'd proven that the A-10, written off by some as obsolete, could accomplish missions that no other aircraft could. She'd shown that close air support wasn't just about technology or firepower. It was about pilots willing to share the risks with the troops they supported. 6 months later, Major Zoey Carter stood in front of a classroom full of experienced A-10 pilots at Nellis Air Force Base. These were seasoned aviators, many with combat experience, here to become weapons officers, the elite instructors who would train everyone else. Today, we're going to talk about terrain-denied close air support, Zoey began. Specifically, we're going to discuss a mission in an unmapped valley where a SEAL team was surrounded by 200 enemy fighters in terrain that conventional doctrine says is unsurvivable for fixed-wing aircraft. She pulled up the gun camera footage from her mission. The students watched in stunned silence as the video showed the dive into the impossible valley, the navigation through rock formations that left no margin for error, the gun runs at altitudes that violated every safety guideline, the precision strikes that eliminated enemy forces within meters of friendly troops. This mission violated every standard operating procedure we have, Zoey said when the video ended. The altitudes were suicidal. The terrain should have been impossible to navigate. The proximity to friendly forces exceeded every safety margin. By any conventional analysis, this mission should have failed catastrophically. She paused, looking at each student. But 12 SEALs are alive today because someone was willing to attempt the impossible when impossible was the only option. Your job as A-10 pilots is to provide close air support to troops on the ground. Sometimes that means following procedures. Sometimes that means writing new procedures because the old ones aren't adequate for the situation you're facing. A hand went up. Ma'am, how did you know you could navigate that terrain without flying into a rock formation? I didn't know for certain, Zoey admitted. I assessed the terrain as best I could from altitude, calculated the angles I'd need, and made the best judgment possible with the information available. Then I trusted my training, my aircraft, and my ability to react if something unexpected appeared. What if you'd been wrong? Another student asked. Then I would have died, and 12 SEALs probably would have died too. But the alternative was definitely letting them die while I stayed safe at altitude. That wasn't acceptable to me. A student in the back raised her hand. Ma'am, how do you decide when to take that kind of risk? When to push beyond the safety margins? Zoey thought carefully before answering. You have to know 3 things absolutely: your aircraft's capabilities, your own capabilities, and the tactical situation. The A-10 can do things other aircraft can't. It's built to fly low, to absorb damage, to deliver precise fire in environments that would destroy other platforms. But it requires a pilot who understands those capabilities and is willing to use them when lives depend on it. She pulled up a tactical diagram. Let's break down the mission step by step. First run was on the eastern ridge. I approached from the west, using a rock formation as a reference point to ensure I had the correct altitude and angle of attack. For the next 4 hours, Zoey meticulously analyzed every aspect of the mission. The students took notes frantically, asking questions about terrain navigation, ammunition selection, communication with ground forces, fuel management, and the split-second decisions that made the difference between success and disaster. But the real lesson wasn't in the technical details. It was in the mindset, the understanding that being an A-10 pilot meant being willing to fly into situations that made other pilots turn back. Because somewhere on the ground, American forces were depending on you to be there when everything else had failed. Over the following years, Zoey became one of the most influential instructors in Air Force history. Her students didn't just learn tactics, they learned what it meant to be a warthog pilot, part of a tradition that valued getting the mission done over staying safe, that measured success by the lives saved rather than the risks avoided. The SEAL Trident pin Cross had given her sat in a frame in her office, next to a photo of the 12 SEALs who'd survived that day in the unmapped valley. Below it was a quote that one of her students had found and printed out. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the judgment that something else is more important than fear. 5 years after the mission, Zoey was back in combat, this time leading a flight of A-10s in support of Special Operations Forces in another region that didn't officially exist on any map. The mission profile was familiar: troops in contact, difficult terrain, need for precision fire support. Valkyrie lead, this is Phantom 1-1. We are taking fire from elevated positions in rough terrain. We need danger close fire support. Zoey looked at the terrain below. Another valley, more rock formations, more impossible flying conditions. But this time, she had 3 wingmen she'd personally trained, pilots who had learned from her mission and understood what the A-10 could do when flown by someone who refused to accept impossible as an answer. Phantom 1-1, Valkyrie lead. We've got you. Describe your situation and stand by for fire support. As she led her flight into another valley that should have been unsurvivable, Zoey thought about the 12 SEALs she'd saved, about the hundreds of students she'd trained, about the tradition she was carrying forward. The A-10 Warthog had been called obsolete, outdated, ready for retirement. But as long as there were troops on the ground who needed support in impossible situations, there would be a need for pilots willing to fly into hell to help them. And as long as there were pilots like Zoey Carter, Valkyrie, willing to push beyond every limit to bring Americans home, the distinctive sound of the GAU-8 cannon would continue to be the most beautiful sound anyone had ever heard when death seemed certain. If you've ever had to do something that terrified you because someone's life depended on it, remember Zoey Carter. Sometimes heroism isn't about being fearless, it's about being absolutely terrified and doing it anyway, because the alternative is unacceptable. The pilot who flew through an unmapped valley to save 12 SEALs proved that the most important qualification for any mission isn't in the technical specifications or the training manual. It's the willingness to be more than you thought possible when lives hang in the balance. And somewhere in an unnamed valley in a region that doesn't exist on maps, there's still an echo of the most beautiful sound those 12 warriors ever heard. The thunder of salvation, delivered by someone who understood that some people are worth any risk to save. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, you can subscribe to see more incredible stories like this one.